left centre of the Pocock. And I'm now going to welcome representatives from the Renmark Paringa Council and the Berri Barmera Council. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to the Senate committees has been provided to you. And I'd like to also thank Senator Whish-Wilson for bringing this inquiry on and getting it put through the Senate. So for the Hansard record, would you please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear today?
Tim Pfeiffer, Chief Executive Officer of Berri Barmera Council.
Ella Winnell, Mayor of the Berri Barmera Council.
Tony Sivier, CEO, Renmark Paringa Council.
Thank you. Would any of you wish to make a brief opening statement? And before you do, there is the media here in the room. Hello, media. You know, I've just got to clear with the witnesses. Are you councillors and mayors and CEOs? You're happy to have your photo taken? And yeah, that's all good? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Didn't think that would be a problem. Just, you know the rules. You can't take photos or record anything on the tables. No paperwork. Okay. Thanks very much. Okay. Who'd like to kick off? Mayor?
Thanks. I acknowledge and thank the Senate Committee for holding a hearing session in South Australia and, more importantly, in the engine room of the Australian wine industry, the Riverland. All too often our region is overlooked despite being Australia's largest wine region, so we appreciate you're here with us today. The Riverland produces 30 to 40% of Australia's wine grape crush and 62% of South Australia's crush, with around 410 tonnes of wine grapes crushed each year. While the Riverland Councils haven't formally resolved a position on the mandatory code of conduct, and it isn't necessarily our role to do so, we're at the coalface of the compounding pressures of the wine industry in Australia. Any outcomes related to the code or any other interventions, support or transition efforts for the wine industry will directly impact our entire community. The three Riverland Councils are home to over 900 wine grape growing properties with more than 20,000 hectares dedicated to wine grape production. The majority of those properties are not only farming businesses but are also people's homes. Approximately 95% of the Riverland's crush goes into large commercial wine brands. There are over 30 wineries in the Riverland, including the largest winery in the Southern Hemisphere just outside of Berri, which has been a critical pillar of our region's economy for over 100 years. The wineries and the wine industry suppliers are the majority of the largest employers in our community. The ongoing challenges facing the wine industry have been felt sharply within our community across these two symbiotic parts of the wine industry, primary production and wine manufacturing. Some challenges like trade tariffs in China, global consumption patterns, high inflation and oversupply are well outside the influence of the local wine industry. Additional structural challenges occur locally, like small land parcels, a remnant of soldier settlement in the district, and an ageing demographic of the irrigation community. Add compounding industry pressures like biosecurity, frost, and critically low grape prices, and we have a perfect storm occurring in the nation's largest wine region. These conditions have led to the unprecedented position of Berri Barmera Council and Renmark Paringa Council offering a rate remission to wine grape growers in financial hardship. Around a third of the Riverland's employment is derived from agriculture or manufacturing, with beverage manufacturing or winemaking being the major manufacturing output. While our neighbouring councils are fortunate to have some agricultural diversification through larger land sizes and broadacre, Berri Barmera's primary production land is almost exclusively under vines. With this single industry reliance, it means that when our wine industry is struggling, the rest of our economy feels it. We see a decline in the areas you'd expect, like agricultural services, retail trade, small business and hospitality, but also our local sporting clubs, community groups see less investment, sponsorship or donations. We see less volunteering as people pick up extra jobs to pay the mortgage. And we see more demand on social services like food bank and mental health services, just to name a few. We also see innovation come from these environments too, and the Riverland has a long history of being innovators, inventors and scrappy fighters who will seize the incredible opportunities of our region to make a life for themselves. Whether it's young farmers looking for their entry into owning their own land, new migrants setting up for a generational future for their families, or existing businesses taking risks to take control of their own destiny, we see some incredible success stories that come from the relatively cheap price of land and water providing an opportunity. From a land use perspective, it's important to note that over the decades, as the Riverland's economy has evolved, the land structure has not, meaning that there's a proliferation of smaller irrigation blocks from the soldier settlement era, which are around 10 to 25 acres or 4 to 10 hectares. The level of income that can be derived from these smaller blocks means many farming families have a need of farm income. The size of these blocks can be a barrier to scaling businesses, increasing markets, value adding or diversification of crop types. The history of soldier settlement blocks, combined with the increase in scale in wine manufacturing operations globally, has led to a large number of very small family farms supplying large wineries. These small-scale primary producers don't have the ability to pass on or offset increasing costs of production. While Council doesn't have a position on the mandatory code, we recognise that many of our local grape growers do face some inherent imbalances in negotiating ability, leverage and alternate options. By enabling early price indicators and consistent payment terms, our grape growers would be able to make business decisions before growing a crop to later sell below the price of production. Ultimately, for our community to be sustainable, we do need a financially sustainable, well-functioning and more stable wine industry across the entire supply chain, both primary production and wine manufacturing, but also through to other parts of the supply chain like exporters and retailers. With the right settings in the industry, the Riverland has the ability to produce wine for Australia and for the world for another 100 years.
Thank you, Mayor Reynolds. Do any of the CEOs wish to add anything?
No.
Nothing? And it was remiss of me, I've just noticed the member for Barker, Mr Tony Passon, in the audience. Great to have you here, Tony, and I know you're a great advocate for your region and, of course, road safety, where we work closely together. Thank you. Senator Ruston.
Look, thank you very much. I suppose whilst we're here on the Code of Conduct, I think, Mayor Winnell, you've pretty much billed the cat. It's a bigger issue for this region than necessarily specifically the Code of Conduct. I'm just wondering, has there been any consideration between the three councils as the peak organisations, I suppose, that represent the interests of this particular wine growing region about what we should be doing to deal with what is globally an oversupply of wine grapes and wine, and how this region can best respond to that, given the greatest asset that we have is flowing past out there? What should we be doing with that from like a structural realignment perspective for this region, and how do we go about doing that?
Look, I think, thanks for your question, Senator. I think it's probably some of the work that PIRSA are looking to work on at the moment, but we certainly need to have some diversification into other industries, so we would suggest there needs to be some work to supply other opportunities for people that do want to exit the wine industry.
Just to add to that as well, I do feel that there is a job to be done in doing some land use mapping of areas under vines in the Riverland to identify genuine alternate land use options. As I mentioned, some of those smaller properties have limited alternate land use options, and they mostly resemble annual cropping, for example, and not necessarily high value. But there are some properties within the Riverland that have genuine alternate high use land uses that may not even be irrigation or irrigated horticulture at all. There could be opportunities for residential developments where there are vines in some towns. There are opportunities for some properties to transition off of irrigation into broadacre cropping. There are opportunities for some land parcels that are along river corridors, for example, to return them to native vegetation, but this thinking and mapping hasn't been done to understand the genuine alternate high value outcomes for that land. And that if that work was done, we would collectively be able to make much more strategic decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are, I mean, in addition, there are, some good and genuine alternate crop types that could be planted. It does take, obviously, will of individual growers and also capital to make that happen. But if we did have that land use mapping that Mayor Winnell speaks of, that would at least enable, and that would include soil type mapping as well. It's not just purely administrative land use mapping. It is also goes down to a more granular level. But something like that would absolutely assist growers in the region, us as local government, state government, to start to look at what potential diversification options may exist. We are a irrigated horticulture community at the end of the day, and Senator, you've obviously been a big part of that community for a very long time. We are an irrigated horticulture community. We will be an irrigated horticulture community for many, many years to come as well, and we have grown off of the back of the wine industry. And as the Mayor mentioned in our opening statement, we do hope that we produce 34% of Australia's wine right now. We are the largest wine producing region in Australia by a long shot. We think, with some sustainability adjustments, we think and we hope that we can continue to be the engine room of the Australian wine industry.
I think there is also some work to be done in the retail space and the marketing space. I'm not sure that it's overly sustainable for consumers to be able to buy wine at $3 a bottle in Australia, and there is a role in the retailers domestically as well as in the way that wine is marketed globally to increase the value of the product that we produce here in the Riverland and to not consider it to be a cheap bulk wine region.
One of the concerns that is constantly raised is around with the wine industry obviously in a pretty tough situation at the moment. The greatest asset that most growers have got is their water. Have you as councils taken any position or view around what the potential implications could be of water exiting your communities and then the subsequent implications on those communities because of the fluidity, pardon the pun, of water transfer?
Yeah, the perfect storm that I mentioned in my opening statement is obviously timed with the Murray-Darling Basin water recovery looming, and we have serious concerns about the industry exiting, the primary production industry exiting when those water recovery measures are undertaken, and if they're not done in a measured and strategic way, if they're done haphazardly, where properties come offline that don't have genuine alternate uses, that has a serious long-term effect for us in our community, our council, our infrastructure, our rates, as well as our irrigation trusts and their infrastructure running through those properties. So we are working as closely as we can with PIRSA on their submissions to the federal government for the transition plans that are going on at the moment. The timing is very scary for us at the moment.
Do you have any clarity in the submissions that you've been working on that actually draws the picture of what the implications to the region could be if we have uncontrolled water buyback out of this region?
I think if you look at the ABARES vulnerability index, we rank third, I think, and I reckon Berri Barmera about 10th. So we see ourselves as being seriously at risk, and that's essentially the work we're doing through the Restoring Our Rivers for diversification, and if there is a large chunk of water that is taken out of our communities.
We understand that the state government have identified it as one of the most serious risks of water recovery.
Have you had any contact or any interaction with the Federal Department of Environment and Water Resources now? I'm not quite sure why they change their name every time the election comes. Have you had any interaction and been able to provide input into the decision making around that whole water recovery process that's currently being undertaken?
We had some early contact with the department officials last June.
Early July.
And haven't had any direct communication with the Commonwealth since, because that process is being, the states are being asked to manage that process.
Do you feel like you're having a satisfactory hearing even though you've had to go via the states, via your state government?
I think there's always challenges, and I think some of those challenges are when it's a state government department operating out of Adelaide, actually having the detailed understanding within that department of what's happening here on the ground and what is also likely here on the ground. I think sometimes there is a bit of a disconnect to an extent.
I think that these kinds of initiatives can be difficult through a government portfolio situation where we have a primary industry issue going on and then a Department of Environment are managing the water recovery, and the crossovers between those two departments at both Commonwealth and state government level means that the people who are delivering those transition programs are specifically responding to the Commonwealth's ask of what submission to create to respond to the planned Commonwealth program. And what it perhaps doesn't allow for is us as a region or the state to look at things outside of that, because at the end of the day, the grape growers in our community are struggling and can exit the industry right now if they want, by selling their water onto the open market. The water recovery program will be an additional entrant into that market, but it is probably going to happen anyway in an uncontrolled way in some instances. And what I'd like to see is state government and the federal government considering the two issues as being related, but having programs and packages in place for each independently, because people will exit regardless of the water recovery.
I think further to that also, we need to ensure that when there is funds coming from the federal government ultimately post water recovery, that it is actually for economic transition and not just economic stimulus. You know, it's not a case of just getting a new stand at the footy oval. That's not going to cut it. It needs to be genuine economic transition so that we can start A, looking at different crop types, but B, also looking at brand new industries and new industry entrants into this region, because we do have a lot to offer. We do have comparatively cheap land that can be used for irrigation, and I mean, as of right now, temporary water is not exorbitantly expensive. So there is the opportunity for different market entrants there. We just need to make sure that any economic inputs into the region is actually for transition and not just stimulus.
Yeah, so just finally, who should be leading? Oh, sorry.
I think it's further to Tim's comments, Mayor Winnell's open. That's really important for us because we have, particularly in Renmark, the way that it was settled with the Chafee brothers, it's actually 10-acre allotments, and it's very difficult to make them viable. But we've seen, good examples of where there's been transition into blueberries, for example, and there's been government assistance with the protected cropping. So, I think that is really important, because it's going to be very difficult to make a 10-acre allotment of vines stack up long term into the future.
One of the added complexities of alternate crop types is that transitioning from grapes to another crop type will support the land use for the primary producers, but the other really important part of our economy is the manufacturing side of this and the winery. And so if crops transition to, say, annual crops without that value added component, then our economy still suffers. And strategically, it is difficult it's a bit chicken and egg between the crops being available for then industry to set up a manufacturing facility to process them, or does the manufacturing facility come and say, everyone now plant this thing so that I can feed my manufacturing facility? They're symbiotic.
So who's doing that work, or who should be doing that work? Because it sounds to me like we are at a crunch time. We need to take an overarching approach. This is not about one council or the other. It's great you're all three sitting there together. So who should be doing that overarching piece of work? Because it strikes me as if we don't do it now, we'll be complaining about this in 5 years' time when it's all gone to hell.
We often reflect on what happened in South Australia when the automotive industry was struggling and collapsing, and the way in which all of government had a response to that, there was an entire wraparound of the community in Tonsley to understand that there needed to be significant economic transition, but also, the community socio-economic impacts beyond that, and they have rebuilt a future for that community. And I think that when this gets handed to one department or another, that's where we get these fragmented responses.
Senator Pocock.
Thank you. I think it's interesting to hear your reflections on the Tonsley transition. One of the characteristics of it from the research about that experience was very early, long planning. including labour market programs and that broad range of integrated approaches. So I totally endorse what you're saying. I wanted to come more specifically to the purpose of this inquiry, which is around the code and the experiences of growers in relation to large wineries. But before I go to that, you said, Mayor, that when the wine industry struggles, our community suffers, and you mentioned food banks and the mental health system. Can you give us a little more reflection about what the current circumstances are doing to the local communities where you are the Mayor, and of course across more broadly in these two local government areas?
Services are stretched thin at the moment across the board. Berri is the home to a lot of the social services that service the entire Riverland, and I know that the line up to Food Bank once a week is just a few doors down from the council office, and driving past there, often the lines are getting longer and longer each week to get access to food on the table. The mental health services can't get enough professionals to come and service the region. The farm support programs don't have enough resources to provide farm counselling. It's across the board, and that then has flow-on impacts to things like domestic violence and physical health as well as mental health, which then puts pressure on our health services, and it's across the board.
And housing pressures, what are they like across these council areas?
Housing's a national issue, and we're not immune to that here. We have a very, very low rental vacancy rate in Berri Barmera.
0.63, I think.
0.63%. And so we're in a really interesting situation in terms of economic development, in that 10 years ago, economic development in our community was about trying to create jobs to attract people to come and work here. But now we're in a situation where we need homes, that people do want to come and live here and work here. And it is not a doom and gloom situation for our economy, provided we can get housing. And to Tim's point about strategic transition efforts rather than stimulus efforts, they are the kinds of opportunities that really will set our community up for the future if we can get significant large-scale housing developments. As part of that land transition, we think our community will be better off.
You mentioned rate concessions as a consequence of the state of the industry. What are they doing to your ability as local government service provider? We walked down the street in Barmera yesterday, beautiful gardens, well-maintained lawns. How is that holding together your service provision in light of the crisis that the wine industry is in?
Yeah, our service, from an operational perspective, our service provision hasn't really changed as yet. And in terms of there has been reasonable access to those rate remissions, but it hasn't actually had a substantial impact on the council finances yet, providing those rate remissions. It may do at some point, but at this point in time, we are still able to maintain our assets. We are still able to maintain our nice, lovely public spaces, especially like the main street of Barmera. But in time, it probably will die.
Just to add as well, I think Tony will speak to Renmark Paringa, but for us at Berri Barmera, because the entire economy is reliant on that wine industry, when discussing rate remissions for primary producers, there is then a conversation about the local retailers in our main street who are also currently struggling because of the wine industry downturn, and if we provide rate remissions to one part of the community, then the rest of the community needs to pick up that slack. And during a cost of living crisis, just having a house at the moment costs you money in rates, and so these are very, very delicate decisions that council needs to make every year about which levers we pull to support which parts of the economy.
Sorry.
Yeah, so I think in terms of Renmark Paringa, we pride ourselves on keeping our community looking good, and we think it's good for the mental health of our community. The impact on us financially is we're running a larger deficit budget this year. We've been inundated. The uptake in the remissions has been greater than we expected. We actually had to extend it because they have to go to a rural financial counsellor to basically get that assessment that comes to us. So there is a financial cost, but right now we think it's important that we support our Winegrape industry.
Thank you. I wanted to then go to the issue of the code and the situation of growers. You describe them, Mayor Winnell, as a region of scrappy fighters. We've had submissions which show the scrappy fighting capability of people and the concerns they have as they face very large buyers for their product. You talked about soldier settlement, the land structures being a real issue, and they are facing a very large concentrated set of buyers. You specifically said, if I heard you correct, that local growers face a power imbalance and that there is a good case for early price indicators and for fairness in payment terms to develop a more stable industry. Have I understood you correctly? And I know you're not taking a specific position around whether the code should be mandatory or not, but you are pointing to changes you would like to see, as I understand. Have I heard you correctly?
Sure, I would just validate it to say that it's critically important for our community that our wineries are financially sustainable too. And if there are additional requirements put on wineries in relation to a code, voluntary, mandatory, or otherwise, it would be important also to ask the wineries what kind of help they need to reduce other red tape or assist them with export so that there is some fairness and balance for them as well.
Okay. So we've heard evidence of recent dispute where wineries a purchaser was unable to get the price they wanted. They end up in a long legal and very, very bitter and costly dispute for many people in your community. Do we need more protection in the event of that kind of breakdown?
I think that the contract negotiation or legal disputes is a good example of the imbalance in ability here, that a small grower simply doesn't have the money to enter into a legal dispute with the wineries if they have one.
And do you see a positive benefit arising from all wineries having to meet the same standard in terms of negotiation? At the moment, signatories, it's not mandatory, some meet it, some don't.
I think one of the challenges with early price indicators is that there are commercial considerations for the wineries in going out early in relation to their competitors, in that the first that go set the price for the season. And so there is a consultation that should be done with the wineries about how those prices are released and when, and whether they're released simultaneously or separately, because that would be a challenge for the wineries, I would think.
Can you comment on the cost to the community of recent disputes and difficulties in negotiation between that multitude of growers and the big wineries?
We wouldn't have any visibility on the scale of investment that's been made by growers in the disputes.
But any pick-up or awareness about the impact on the community in terms of the well-being of it, and how does it affect the nature of your community?
I think that we probably see the impacts to the community as being multifaceted rather than just in relation to the disputes. We think that the industry is struggling as a whole, and there are a lot of socioeconomic impacts of that, and that entering into disputes is one part of a much more complex story.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator. Just quickly then, have you worked closely with the industry when you talk about transitional cropping and that sort of stuff to get an idea of how many years growers, if they did transition, got rid of their vines and moved to something else, how many years they would be out without any earnings? Have you done that work with the industry?
Sorry, I don't quite understand.
Well, you know, so if they were to get rid of the vines and put in almonds or whatever, I think I've heard something up to about 5 or 6 years, or citrus, you know, where growers would have no income.
It depends on the crop that they transition to, and this is about that business planning and having the knowledge of what the highest value use is of that land other than vines. Some crops can come online within a year or two. You know, pumpkins, for example, you plant them and they grow. There are other crops like high density olives that can come online in a similar time period as an alternate vine variety, and then other crops that take a much longer lead time. The example that you gave of pulling out vines and putting in almonds is a classic example of the limitations of our small soldier settlement blocks, that it is simply not viable for them to plant a crop like almonds because they don't have enough scale to undertake that kind of operation.
Sure. So you have done that work with the growers. You've had those conversations.
Probably more at an industry level.
Yeah, with the industry. Yeah.
At an industry level, yeah, and you know, we have had the conversations with groups who are interested in, the Mayor mentioned, high density olives, which is for olive oil production, and those discussions have been very much around, you know, what the transition would look like, what the timeframes between having a productive crop to having a productive crop would actually be, from grapes to olives, and just getting an understanding as a community organisation as to what that could potentially be.
I think it's interesting as well to reflect in terms of crop transition on the demographic of our growers, that they are, many of them are in an ageing demographic. They're not necessarily in a position or don't have access to capital through finance institutions to do any large-scale transition. They don't necessarily have a succession plan to hand the business over to their children, and the idea of innovating our way out of this isn't really a simple fix. We need new entrants into the market to purchase these properties with their vision for the land, not necessarily expect the existing cohort of growers to enter a new industry because they've been grape growers their whole life. That's what they know how to do, and asking them to pull them out and become citrus growers, you know, that's not what they do for a living.
And I had no intention of going down that path. It's just that you raised it. Because we're here to talk about the code, so I just wanted to clarify that.
We think that there's opportunity in terms of things like the northern expansion of housing in Adelaide, pushing out the market gardeners in northern Adelaide. Now, those particular market gardeners are not necessarily looking to continue to be market gardeners, but that then presents a potential food security challenge for the community, and maybe the Riverland on those smaller allotments could attract new market gardeners, potentially new migrants, or larger scale commercial market gardening here in the Riverland. But again, that would require some kind of interventions or incentives or promotion to do so.
Right, thank you very much. Well, look, that